I found the dwelling on the third day of November when the canyon air had turned sharp enough to make my lungs ache with each breath. The thermometer clipped to my pack read 28 degrees at sunrise, and I knew my modern tent would not hold warmth past midnight. I had been hiking the Utah Canyon country for 6 days, following dry washes and ancient trails, looking for something I could not name. When I saw the alcove 80 feet up the south-facing cliff, I stopped walking. The sandstone glowed amber in the early light, and tucked into its curve was a structure of stacked stone and clay mortar, dark against the pale rock. I had seen photographs of such places, ancestral pueblo and ruins preserved by dryness and elevation, but photographs do not convey the geometry of survival. This dwelling was not placed here by accident or aesthetic choice. Every wall, every stone, every angle was an answer to a question the cold had asked 600 years ago. I set my pack down and looked at my tent. A $400 four-season model with aluminum poles and ripstop nylon. It had kept me alive through 3 nights of near-freezing temperatures, but each morning I woke to condensation frozen on the interior walls, my sleeping bag damp with my own breath. The tent was designed in a laboratory somewhere far from this canyon, engineered by people who understood fabrics and thermal properties, but it did not understand this specific place, this wind, this cold, that came up from the canyon floor like water, filling a well. I climbed to the dwelling using handholds worn smooth by centuries of use. The route was obvious once I looked, a crack system that zigzagged up the cliff face, wide enough for feet but not so wide that it would channel water during storms. At the top I pulled myself onto a flat shelf of sandstone and stood at the entrance to the alcove. The space was larger than I expected. The overhang created a ceiling 15 feet high at the front edge, curving back into the cliff face where it met the dwelling's rear wall. The alcove extended 40 feet deep and perhaps 60 feet wide, a natural room carved by water and wind over millions of years. The dwelling itself occupied the back third of this space, 3 stone rooms connected by low doorways, walls built directly against the sandstone, rising 8 feet to meet the natural ceiling. I stepped inside the first room and felt the temperature shift. Not warmth, not yet, but an absence of wind. The air was still. Outside, the November wind moved through juniper and pinon with a sound like running water. But here, 80 feet above the canyon, I could hear my own breathing, my boots scuffing the floor, nothing else. I placed my hand on the wall. The stone was cool, but not cold, and it had a texture I had not expected. Rough-grained, each piece of sandstone carefully shaped to fit against its neighbor, the gaps filled with mortar that had hardened to the density of the rock itself. I pressed harder and felt the wall's thickness. At least 18 inches of stone and mud, solid as the cliff behind it. The room had 2 small windows, each about 12 inches square, positioned at head height on the south-facing wall. Through them, I could see the canyon spreading below, the cottonwoods along the dry wash turning yellow, their leaves bright against the red dirt. The windows were not centered or symmetrical. They were placed precisely where they would catch morning sun, where light would enter at the angle needed to warm the interior without creating glare or heat loss. I set up my tent at the base of the cliff that night because I did not yet understand what I had found. I wanted to compare. I wanted to know if the dwelling's stillness was real or if I had imagined the temperature shift, the absence of wind bite, the way the stone had felt almost alive under my hand. By midnight, I woke to use the latrine and saw my breath clouding white inside the tent. The nylon walls were beaded with frozen condensation. I was wearing every layer I had brought, and still my feet were numb. I checked the thermometer, 29 degrees outside, perhaps 32 inside the tent. The sleeping bag was damp. I climbed up before breakfast. I wanted to know if the sun made a difference. At the top, I stood in the first room and felt warmth on my face. I put my hand on the back wall, the one built directly against the cliff face. The stone was warm. I pulled out my thermometer and held it in the center of the room, away from direct sunlight. The reading was 58 degrees. Outside in the shade, the air temperature was 34 degrees. Inside the dwelling, without a fire, the temperature was 24 degrees warmer. I made the decision to spend the night in the dwelling on my fourth day in the canyon, after watching the sun track across the alcove from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m., and seeing how the structure received light like a vessel receives water. The modern camper in me resisted. This was a protected archaeological site, a place I should observe but not inhabit. But the student of survival knew I would learn nothing from looking. I needed to feel the night, measure the darkness, wake at 3 a.m., and know if the stone held its heat. I brought no sleeping bag into the dwelling. I wanted to know what the structure could do by itself, without modern insulation buffering my body against the truth. I carried up 2 wool blankets, a sleeping pad for ground insulation, my thermometer, a notebook, and a headlamp. I would not build a fire. The sun left the alcove at 3:47 p.m. I recorded the time and the temperature, 71 degrees inside the main room, 43 degrees outside in the shade. I sat on the floor with my back against the rear wall and felt the warmth radiating through my jacket. The stone was hot to the touch, uncomfortable if I pressed my bare hand flat against it. 6 hours of November sun had charged the sandstone like a battery. I explored the dwelling more carefully than I had on previous days. The first room was the largest, approximately 12 feet by 14 feet, with the 2 small windows I had noted before. The walls were not uniform in thickness. The southern wall, facing the alcove opening and the canyon beyond, was nearly 2 feet thick. The wall against the cliff face was thinner, perhaps 14 inches, because the bedrock behind it provided additional insulation. The second room was smaller, perhaps 8 feet square, and this was where the cooking fires had been built. The back wall was blackened from floor to ceiling, with soot layered so thick it had a texture like velvet. I examined the fire area, a simple ring of stones set directly against the cliff face. No chimney, no vent pipe, just an opening in the south wall about 18 inches square that served as both window and smoke exit. The third room was the smallest and had no windows at all. A storage room, perhaps, or a sleeping space for children, where darkness would be complete and temperature most stable. I stood in its center and closed my eyes, feeling the air, utterly still. The room felt like being inside the earth itself, not buried, but held. At 5 p.m. I recorded the temperature again, 68 degrees in the main room, 39 degrees outside. The rate of heat loss was slower than I expected. The dwelling was not hemorrhaging warmth the way my tent had. The stone was releasing its stored heat grudgingly, slowly, as if it understood the night would be long. I ate a cold dinner of jerky and dried fruit, sitting in the doorway between the first and second rooms, watching the canyon fill with shadow. By 7 p.m. the stars were visible, hard white points in a sky going deep purple. The temperature outside had dropped to 34 degrees. Inside the dwelling it was 64 degrees. I laid out my sleeping pad in the main room, positioned so my head would rest near the back wall where the heat was strongest. I spread 1 wool blanket beneath me and kept the other folded beside me in case I needed it later. I lay down at 8 p.m. The stone wall radiated warmth against the left side of my body. I could feel the heat through my jacket, through my shirt, against my ribs and shoulder. Not the sharp heat of a fire or the forced air of a furnace, but a steady, persistent warmth that seemed to come from deep inside the rock itself. I placed my hand flat against the wall, still hot. I woke at 11 p.m. and checked the thermometer. Outside temperature 28 degrees. Inside 61 degrees. I had not needed the second blanket. My feet were warm. My hands were warm. I was lying in a 600-year-old stone room without a fire, in late November, at elevation, and I was comfortable. At 2 a.m. I woke again, cold enough to reach for the second blanket. I spread it over myself and checked the temperature. Outside, 24 degrees. Inside, 57 degrees. The dwelling had lost 7 degrees in 7 hours, while the outside temperature had dropped 14 degrees. I slept until dawn, waking when the first light touched the alcove ceiling. My breath did not cloud the air. I checked the thermometer one last time. Outside temperature 22 degrees, inside temperature 55 degrees. The dwelling had brought me through the coldest part of the night and lost only 16 degrees total from its 3 p.m. peak. The sun reached the alcove at 9:17 a.m., a hard-edged blade of light that swept across the curved ceiling and poured into the dwelling like something liquid. I was sitting in the first room with my notebook, recording temperatures every 30 minutes, trying to understand the building's rhythm. When the light arrived, I felt the temperature shift within minutes. I had spent the previous day hiking the canyon rim, looking at the dwelling from above, and trying to understand why it was positioned exactly where it was. The alcove was one of dozens in this section of cliff, but most of the others faced east or west, or were too shallow to provide adequate overhang, or were too high to access easily. This alcove faced almost due south, angled perhaps 15 degrees to the southeast. From the rim, I had watched the sun's progression across the sky, tracking its path from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., noting where the shadows fell, where the light pooled. The overhang's curve acted like a lens or reflector, directing morning sun deeper into the alcove than should have been possible from simple geometry alone. The ancestors had not created this feature. Nature had carved the alcove over millennia, but they had recognized it for what it was, a solar collector. Now, sitting inside as the sun arrived, I could feel what I had observed from above. The light did not enter harshly. It came in at a low angle, hitting the alcove ceiling first, reflecting off the sandstone's rough surface, diffusing into a softer glow that spread across the entire space before concentrating on the back wall where the dwelling was built. I stood and walked to the south-facing wall, the one with the 2 small windows. The eastern window caught the morning sun at a sharp angle, channeling light directly onto the back wall where it would be absorbed by the thermal mass. The western window remained in shadow until afternoon, when the sun's angle shifted and light entered from a different direction, warming the same wall from a new angle, ensuring that the entire surface received maximum exposure. I climbed onto the roof of the dwelling and examined the overhang from underneath. The rock was smooth from water action, curved in a way that suggested constant flow over thousands of years. The curve was not uniform. At the front edge of the alcove, the overhang protruded sharply, creating a drip line where water would fall during storms. This kept the alcove interior dry. Further back, the curve became more gradual, allowing winter sun to penetrate deep into the space. I measured the overhang's geometry. The alcove extended 43 feet from front to back. The ceiling height at the front edge was 17 feet. At the back wall where the dwelling was built, the ceiling height was 12 feet. This gradual slope meant that solar radiation entered the alcove at the same angle it would hit a south-facing wall, maximizing exposure. The dwelling's placement within the alcove was equally precise. The front wall was positioned 6 feet back from the alcove edge, creating an entrance area that was covered but open to the air. This space served as a thermal buffer. Cold air entering the alcove would sink and flow past the dwelling's entrance without penetrating the rooms themselves. I sat on the roof and watched the wind. Outside the alcove, juniper trees bent and swayed in gusts that must have been 20 or 25 miles per hour. Dead leaves tumbled across the canyon floor. But inside the alcove, the air was nearly still. I held up a piece of thread and watched it hang almost vertical. The overhang directed wind over the alcove rather than into it. I examined the mortar joints again, this time looking for patterns. The builders had not applied mortar uniformly. In some areas, particularly on the south-facing wall exposed to weather, the joints were thick and smooth. In other areas, particularly on the back wall that rested against the cliff, the mortar was thinner, sometimes just a fine line of clay, pressed between rocks. The stones themselves varied in size and shape. Most were flat sandstone slabs, roughly rectangular, ranging from the size of a shoebox to the size of a suitcase. But at the corners and around the windows, the builders had used longer, more irregular pieces, some of them extending 18 inches into the wall's thickness, tying the structure together like interlocking fingers. By 3 p.m., the sun was beginning to leave the alcove. The light shifted from white to amber, slanting across the room at a steep angle. I recorded the temperature, 73 degrees inside, 52 degrees outside. The back wall was hot enough that I could only keep my hand pressed against it for 5 seconds. The builders had not stumbled upon the right location by accident. They had observed the sun and the wind and the stone for years, perhaps generations, learning how heat moved, where cold air pooled. I decided to track the dwelling's temperature cycle over 3 full days, recording measurements every hour from dawn to dawn, trying to quantify what I could feel in my body but not yet explain with precision. The thermometer was a simple analog device, accurate to within 2 degrees, sufficient for my purpose. I placed it in the center of the main room, 5 feet above the floor, away from direct sunlight, measuring the ambient air temperature. Day 1 began at 6 a.m. with an inside temperature of 54 degrees and an outside temperature of 19 degrees. The dwelling had coasted through the night on stored heat, maintaining a 35-degree differential without any active heating. The sun arrived at 9:22 a.m., and within 30 minutes the inside temperature had climbed to 62 degrees. By noon, it reached 68 degrees. The temperature was rising slowly, steadily, without spikes or plateaus. I walked outside onto the alcove floor and measured the temperature there, 62 degrees, 6 degrees cooler than inside the dwelling. The alcove was receiving full sunlight, but the air temperature remained moderate because heat was radiating away into the open canyon as fast as it arrived. The dwelling's walls, by contrast, were trapping the heat they received, storing it in the stone's mass. At 1 p.m. I measured the back wall's surface temperature with a second thermometer held directly against the stone. The reading was 89 degrees, 21 degrees hotter than the ambient air inside the room. I measured the south wall, 72 degrees, the floor, 65 degrees, the ceiling, 71 degrees. Every surface in the room was warmer than the air, and the air temperature was rising because the surfaces were heating it through radiation. I thought about my tent and how it heated when the sun hit it. The fabric would warm quickly, the air inside would spike to 80 or 90 degrees within minutes, becoming uncomfortably hot. Then, when the sun moved off the tent, the temperature would crash back down almost as quickly. The tent had no thermal mass. It responded instantly to changes in solar input. The dwelling operated on the opposite principle. The stone walls were slow to heat and slow to cool. The mass of rock, I estimated at least 30 tons of sandstone and mortar in the main room's walls alone, absorbed solar energy and stored it physically. And because the walls were thick, the heat had to conduct through 18 or 20 inches of material before it could escape to the outside air, a process that took hours. By 3 p.m., the inside temperature peaked at 74 degrees. I had been recording for 9 hours, and the data showed a nearly perfect logarithmic curve. Rapid increase in the morning, gradual leveling through midday, plateau in the afternoon. The back wall's surface temperature had reached 94 degrees. The sun left the alcove at 3:51 p.m. The temperature inside was 73 degrees. Outside, now in full shade, the thermometer read 41 degrees. I watched the numbers over the next 6 hours. The cooling curve was even more dramatic than the heating curve. The dwelling lost only 1 degree per hour for the first 3 hours, then slowed to less than 1 degree per hour after dark. By 10 p.m., the inside temperature was 67 degrees. Outside, it was 29 degrees. The dwelling was holding a 38-degree differential, and the walls were still radiating warmth I could feel by holding my hand 6 inches away from the surface. I slept that night without any blankets, just to see if I could. The temperature at midnight was 64 degrees. At 3 a.m. it was 61 degrees. At 6 a.m. it was 58 degrees. The dwelling had lost 16 degrees over 15 hours while maintaining a comfortable sleeping environment. I calculated the thermal mass using rough estimates. The main room's walls contained approximately 400 cubic feet of stone and mortar, weighing roughly 30 tons. Sandstone has a specific heat of about 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. A heating degree from 60 to 74 degrees represented about 168,000 BTUs of stored energy in the walls alone. For comparison, my propane camp stove could produce about 8,000 BTUs per hour. I would need to run the stove continuously for 21 hours to equal the energy the dwelling's walls absorbed from 6 hours of sunlight. I thought about modern building design and how completely we had abandoned this principle. We insulate buildings to prevent heat transfer in both directions, then use furnaces and air conditioners to maintain constant temperature. The ancestors who built this dwelling had no choice but to work with thermal dynamics, and the result was a structure that still functioned perfectly 6 centuries later. I spent the 4th day studying the space outside the dwelling, the 30 feet of open floor between the stone rooms and the alcove's edge. I had been treating this area as empty space, but as I watched the air move and the light shift, I realized it was as carefully designed as the walls themselves. The alcove was not just a natural shelter the builders had taken advantage of, it was the primary reason the dwelling worked at all. I started by mapping the overhang's geometry more precisely than I had before. I drove a stake into the ground at the alcove's front edge and ran a string back to the cliff face, marking intervals every 5 feet. At each interval, I measured the ceiling height. The alcove had a specific mathematical shape, parabolic rather than circular, with a ceiling that descended at a 7-degree angle from front to back. This angle was critical. In winter, when the sun is low in the southern sky, light entered the alcove at approximately 30 degrees above the horizon. The moist, descending ceiling meant that light hitting the front of the alcove was reflected toward the back wall where the dwelling sat. I confirmed this by watching the morning sun's progression. Reflections from the curved ceiling spread light across the entire alcove, including the back wall. I tried to imagine what would happen in summer when the sun's angle was higher. At the summer solstice, the sun would reach approximately 77 degrees above the horizon at noon. At that angle, sunlight would hit the front edge of the overhang and be blocked, never penetrating deep into the alcove. The overhang acted as a seasonal regulator, allowing winter sun to flood the space while excluding summer sun. I set up the thermometer in different positions across the alcove floor and measured temperature at noon on a cloudless day. At the front edge, in direct sunlight, 78 degrees. 10 feet back, still in direct sun, 81 degrees. 20 feet back, in mixed sun and shade, 74 degrees. At the dwelling's entrance, 30 feet back and fully shaded, 68 degrees. I measured the outside air temperature in full sun at the base of the cliff, 54 degrees. The alcove floor in direct sun was 27 degrees warmer than free air at the same elevation. The sandstone was functioning as a solar collector, absorbing radiation and converting it to heat faster than the air could carry that heat away. I sat at the alcove edge and watched the wind. A steady breeze from the northwest was blowing down canyon at perhaps 15 miles per hour. I could feel it on my face. But inside the alcove, the air was nearly calm. I held up a feather and watched it drift slowly toward the alcove floor with no lateral movement. The overhang was deflecting the wind. Air flowing across the canyon hit the cliff face and was forced upward, passing over the alcove rather than into it. The dwelling sat in a pocket of stillness, protected from the constant wind that scoured the exposed canyon landscape. I tested this by releasing smoke from a small bundle of dry grass at different positions in the alcove. At the front edge, smoke was immediately caught by turbulence and dispersed into the open air. 10 feet back, smoke rose straight up until it reached the curved ceiling, then spread horizontally along the rock surface. At the dwelling entrance, smoke rose to the ceiling and remained there, trapped in the upper portion of the alcove. I realized the buffer zone between the dwelling and the alcove edge was serving multiple functions simultaneously. It was a thermal buffer, allowing cold air from outside to mix with warm air from the alcove before reaching the dwelling entrance. It was a wind buffer, eliminating drafts that would otherwise strip heat from the stone walls. It was a light modifier, taking harsh, direct sunlight and softening it through reflection and diffusion. I noticed shallow depressions in the sandstone floor near the dwelling entrance, roughly circular, about 18 inches in diameter and 2 inches deep. I counted 7 of them in a rough arc around the doorway. They were too regular to be natural erosion, grinding surfaces. These were places where people had knelt and ground seeds or processed other foods using stone tools over years or decades. The alcove had contained this life, had provided the protected space where such daily work could happen. Without the overhang, without the wind protection and the thermal moderation, this location would have been uninhabitable. The alcove showed a different approach. Find the place where nature has already done half the work, then build minimally, working with the existing advantages rather than trying to overcome them through technology. On the 5th day, I became obsessed with the 6 feet of empty space between the dwelling's front wall and the edge of the alcove floor. The distance seemed arbitrary at first, but nothing else about this structure was arbitrary, and I knew the builders must have had a reason for not pushing the rooms all the way to the alcove edge. I started by measuring the temperature gradient in that space more precisely. I used 3 thermometers, placing them at 2-foot intervals in a line from the dwelling entrance to the alcove edge. I measured at floor level, at 3 feet height, and at 6 feet height, checking readings every 30 minutes from dawn to dusk. The pattern was immediate and clear. Cold air was flowing into the alcove from outside, staying close to the ground, moving slowly across the buffer zone, then sinking past the dwelling entrance toward the back of the alcove. But the cold air layer was shallow, only about 18 inches deep. Above that layer, warmer air from the dwelling was moving in the opposite direction, flowing toward the alcove opening, rising slightly as it warmed. At dawn, when outside temperature was 21 degrees and the dwelling interior was 56 degrees, I recorded the following: floor level at alcove edge, 28 degrees. Floor level at dwelling entrance, 41 degrees. 3 feet high at alcove edge, 42 degrees. 3 feet high at dwelling entrance, 54 degrees. 6 feet high at dwelling entrance, 56 degrees. The numbers showed exactly what I was feeling. Cold air was creeping in at ground level, but by the time it reached the dwelling entrance, it had warmed by 13 degrees just from passing through the buffer zone. Meanwhile, the air at head height was nearly the same temperature everywhere in the alcove. I lit a small sage bundle and used the smoke to visualize the airflow. Smoke released at floor level near the alcove edge was immediately caught by the incoming cold airstream and pulled toward the dwelling. But when it reached the buffer zone, it began to swirl, mixing with warmer rising air, eventually drifting upward instead of continuing forward. The dwelling's front wall was positioned precisely at the point where cold air stopped flowing in a coherent stream and began to mix turbulently with warm air. If the wall had been at the alcove edge, cold air would have been constantly pushing against it, conducting heat out of the dwelling, creating drafts. If the wall had been farther back, the cold air would have penetrated into the living space. I thought about cold air drainage and how it works in any landscape. Cold air is denser than warm air, so it flows downhill like water, seeking the lowest point. The alcove was positioned partway up the cliff, not at the base where the coldest air would pool. At dawn, before the sun heated the canyon, the coldest air was settling to the canyon floor 80 feet below. But even at the alcove level, cold air was denser and wanted to sink. The buffer zone allowed it to do exactly that. Cold air flowed into the alcove, moved across the buffer space, then continued sinking past the dwelling entrance toward the back of the alcove. There was a narrow gap between the dwelling's side wall and the alcove's side wall, and I could feel cold air flowing through that gap like a stream through a culvert. The builders had created a passive ventilation system using nothing but temperature differentials and basic physics. Cold air entered at the alcove front, flowed through the buffer zone where it was warmed and slowed, then sank past the dwelling and collected at the back where it could not affect living space. Warm air from the dwelling rose, spread across the alcove ceiling, then slowly flowed toward the opening. I measured the airflow velocity using a ribbon tied to a stick. At the alcove edge, the incoming air moved at approximately 0.5 miles per hour, barely perceptible but measurable. In the buffer zone, velocity dropped to perhaps 0.2 miles per hour. At the dwelling entrance, air was essentially still. The 6-foot distance was not arbitrary. It was the minimum distance required to allow incoming cold air to warm and slow before reaching the dwelling. Modern buildings have tall doorways that extend from floor to ceiling, creating a chimney effect. The low doorways in the dwelling minimize this effect. Warm air was trapped. Cold air was slowed. I spent the afternoon sitting in the buffer zone, experiencing it as living space. The sandstone floor was warm from the sun. The air was still. I was protected from wind but could see out across the canyon. The dwelling was immediately behind me, its warmth radiating through the doorway. On the 6th day, I focused on the mortar, the clay, and sand mixture that held the stone walls together and sealed the gaps against weather. I had been taking the mortar for granted, assuming it was simple mud. But when I examined it closely, I realized it was as carefully engineered as every other aspect of the dwelling. I started by carefully extracting small samples from several locations using a wooden sliver, taking only enough material to examine. Each sample crumbled easily in my fingers but did not turn to powder. It had structure, elasticity, a slight springiness that suggested fibers or binding materials beyond simple clay. I spread one sample on a flat rock and picked through it with a thorn. The mortar was not uniform. I could see layers, or rather a matrix of different materials compressed together. The base was definitely clay, fine-grained, smooth when moistened, sticky. Mixed through the clay were grains of sand, varying in size, and threaded through everything were organic fibers, some brown and decomposed, most of them 2 to 4 inches long and finer than human hair. I recognized some of the fibers as yucca. Others looked like juniper bark, shredded fine. The fibers were not randomly distributed. They were oriented, mostly running parallel to the wall surface, as if the mortar had been applied in layers and the fibers had aligned themselves with the motion of the application. I made test batches of mortar using materials I found near the dwelling. The clay came from a deposit down canyon. I mixed it with sand, adding water until the consistency felt right. Then I added shredded juniper bark that I pounded between rocks. The mixture was difficult to work at first, but when I added more water and kneaded it like bread dough, it became smooth and plastic. I smeared some of this experimental mortar on a flat stone and let it dry in the sun. After 4 hours, it had cracked extensively. I mixed another batch with more fiber and less water. This batch cracked less when it dried. A third batch with equal parts clay and sand by volume, plus about 10% fiber by volume, dried with minimal cracking. The fiber content was critical. Clay alone shrinks as it dries, creating cracks. Sand reduces shrinkage, but makes the mortar brittle. Fiber reinforces the material, distributing stress, preventing crack propagation. The builders had figured out the right proportions through trial and error, probably over generations. But the mortar's composition was only part of what made it effective. I examined the walls carefully, looking at how the mortar was placed. It was not simply stuffed into gaps between stones. It was built up in layers, each layer approximately half an inch thick, each one allowed to partially dry before the next was applied. I could see the layer lines in places where the mortar had eroded slightly. Layering created a stronger wall. It allowed the mortar to cure gradually, reducing cracking. It created a matrix that resisted crack propagation, and it meant the builders could adjust water content for each layer, wetter mortar for the bottom layers that needed to stick to stone, drier mortar for the outer layers that needed to resist weathering. The mortar also varied in thickness depending on location. Where two flat stones met cleanly, the mortar layer might be only a quarter-inch thick. Where stones had irregular surfaces or where corners needed reinforcement, the mortar was an inch or more thick, built up in multiple layers over several days. I examined the weathered outer surface where rain and wind had exposed the mortar to centuries of erosion. The surface was hard and smooth, almost glazed, darker than the mortar below it. I scratched at it with a sharp stone and found the outer layer was much harder than the interior material. Rainwater, evaporating from the surface over hundreds of years, had carried dissolved minerals to the surface where they deposited, creating a natural protective layer. I tested the mortar's permeability by moistening a small section with water. The water soaked in quickly, darkening the mortar, but after an hour the darkness had faded and the mortar looked dry again. The material had absorbed moisture and released it through evaporation. A concrete mortar would have trapped the moisture, but this clay-based mortar breathed, preventing ice formation inside the wall. This breathing property explained why the dwelling stayed comfortable. My breath, my sweat, the moisture from my body was absorbed by the walls during the night, then released during the day. The walls were functioning as humidity buffers, maintaining a comfortable middle range that modern buildings can only achieve with mechanical ventilation. The mortar joints were not just clay and sand. They were condensed wisdom, the physical embodiment of hundreds of years of learning about how materials behave in this specific environment. On the seventh day, I turned my attention downward to the floor, the surface I had been walking on for a week without really examining. I had assumed it was simply the natural sandstone bedrock, smoothed by use. But when I looked closely, I saw it was more complex. The builders had modified the bedrock, had created a floor system that contributed to the dwelling's thermal performance. The bedrock was visible in places, especially near the walls where foot traffic had been lighter. It was the same sandstone as the cliff itself, fine-grained and buff-colored, laid down in thin horizontal layers. But in the center of each room, where people would have walked most frequently, the bedrock was covered with a layer of compacted earth about 2 inches thick. I scraped carefully at this earth layer with my pocket knife. It was not loose soil. It was packed so hard that I had to work the knife blade under it and pry to get a sample loose. The material was a mixture of fine sand, clay, and what looked like ash or charcoal dust, compressed until it had the density of soft stone. The compacted earth was darkest in the center of the room and lighter near the walls, suggesting it had built up over time from repeated application. I could see faint layers when I examined the edge of the floor, thin lines marking different episodes of surfacing. Each layer was perhaps a quarter-inch thick, and I counted at least 8 layers in the main room. I tested the floor's temperature at different times of day At dawn, the floor was 56 degrees, while the back wall was 62 degrees. At noon, the floor was 64 degrees, while the back wall was 88 degrees. At midnight, the floor was 59 degrees, while the back wall was 69 degrees. The floor had a narrower temperature range than the walls, heating more slowly during the day, but also cooling more slowly at night. This made sense in terms of solar exposure. The walls received direct and reflected sunlight for 6 or 7 hours each day, while the floor received mostly indirect light and radiant heat from the walls. The floor absorbed heat more slowly, but because it was in contact with the earth beneath, it had access to a much larger thermal reservoir. The floor was coupling the dwelling's interior to the earth's thermal stability. I measured the bedrock temperature at different depths by digging a small test hole outside the dwelling. At the surface, the sandstone was 48 degrees at noon. 6 inches down, it was 52 degrees. 12 inches down, it was 54 degrees. The temperature was increasing with depth, approaching the Earth's mean annual temperature for this latitude, approximately 55 degrees. Inside the dwelling, the floor was in thermal contact with this warmer bedrock through direct conduction. Heat was flowing upward from the earth into the floor, very slowly but continuously, 24 hours per day. This heat flow was small compared to the solar gain through the walls, but it was constant and it never reversed. The earth was always warming the floor, providing a baseline temperature. The compacted earth layer on top of the bedrock served several functions. First, it provided a smoother surface than the raw bedrock. Second, it absorbed foot impact and reduced wear. Third, and most important for thermal performance, it acted as an additional layer of thermal mass with different properties than the stone. Earth has higher specific heat than sandstone, meaning it can store more heat per pound per degree of temperature increase. It also has lower thermal conductivity, meaning heat moves through it more slowly. The earth layer absorbed heat from the air during the day, stored it, and released it slowly at night, with a different time constant than the walls. I tested this by measuring floor temperature every 2 hours for 24 hours. The floor temperature at the center of the room varied only 8 degrees over the entire cycle, from 59 degrees at dawn to 67 degrees in mid-afternoon, then back down to 59 degrees by the next dawn. The walls varied 35 degrees over the same period. The floor was providing thermal stability, a steady baseline that moderated the dwelling's overall temperature swings. The floor's position below the level of foot traffic also meant it was the coolest surface in the room at any given time, which mattered for comfort. A hot floor is uncomfortable to stand on. A very cold floor draws heat from feet uncomfortably fast. The dwelling's floor stayed in the comfortable middle range. The ash content in the floor material suggested the builders had incorporated waste from cooking fires into the floor mix. Ash contains minerals that help bind the material, and it has antibacterial properties. Using fire ash in the floor meant nothing was wasted. On the 8th day, I studied the soot patterns on the ceiling and walls of the second room, trying to understand how fire had been used in this dwelling. The soot was undeniable: thick black deposits on the ceiling, gray staining on the back wall, residue that could only come from repeated fires over a long period. I started by mapping the soot distribution. The darkest area was on the ceiling directly above the fire ring, a patch perhaps 6 feet in diameter where the soot was so thick it had a glossy appearance. From this central patch, lighter staining spread across the rest of the ceiling, fading toward the edges. On the walls, soot was concentrated on the back wall above the fire ring, creating a dark fan shape. The front wall had almost no soot at all. This pattern told a story about smoke movement. It rose from the fire, hit the ceiling, spread outward, then was drawn toward the window where it could escape. I examined the fire ring itself more closely. It was a simple circle of stones about 30 inches in diameter, the stones fire-cracked and discolored, but still intact. The floor inside the ring was covered with a thin layer of ash, white and powdery. I brushed some aside and found the sandstone beneath was not just blackened, but actually altered by heat. The normally buff-colored rock had turned reddish. The volume of ash was modest, maybe a few gallons. This suggested the builders had cleaned out the fire ring periodically. The ash might have been used in the floor mortar or spread outside. Nothing would have been wasted. The key question was what the fires had been used for. Cooking, certainly. But had the fires also been used for heating? The soot pattern suggested not. If fires had been kept burning all night for warmth, the soot would be more evenly distributed. The pattern I was seeing was consistent with fires that burned for a few hours each day. I tested this hypothesis by building a small fire in the ring. I used dead juniper wood, small pieces, arranged in a simple teepee. The wood ignited easily. Within minutes I had a fire burning hot and clean. The smoke rose straight up, hit the ceiling, spread outward in a horizontal layer, then was drawn toward the window opening. Within 5 minutes, most of the smoke had exited the room. The fire burned for about 20 minutes before collapsing to coals. During that time, I measured the temperature increase in the room. At the start, 62 degrees. At peak fire, 68 degrees. After the fire died, 65 degrees. The fire had raised the room temperature 6 degrees while it was burning, but the temperature was already dropping back toward baseline within minutes. I let the fire burn down to coals and cooked a simple meal. The cooking process took about 15 minutes. Total wood used, maybe 3 pounds. After the meal, I examined the fresh soot on the ceiling. A faint gray haze had deposited above the fire, barely visible against the existing black layer, but definitely present. One fire, one meal cooked, one detectable layer of soot. If the dwelling was occupied by a family cooking 3 meals per day, that would be over 1,000 fires per year. The soot layer I was seeing represented that much cooking. But the fires had not been used to heat the dwelling. The evidence was clear. The soot pattern showed fires burning for a few hours at most, and my own measurements showed the dwelling maintained comfortable temperature without fire. The solar gain through the walls, combined with the thermal mass, was sufficient. Fire was used only for cooking, providing light, creating a social focus. I thought about fuel efficiency. In this landscape, wood was not abundant. Using fire for space heating would have required enormous amounts of wood, perhaps 20 or 30 pounds per day. Over a winter, that would mean thousands of pounds, requiring hours of daily labor, depleting the surrounding forest. By using the dwelling's passive solar design to provide warmth, the builders reduced their wood consumption by perhaps 80% or 90%. The 3 pounds needed for cooking was sustainable. It could be gathered from dead wood, from branches broken by wind. The forest could provide that much without degradation. I also noticed that the fire ring was positioned against the back wall rather than in the center of the room. This placement made sense. It placed the fire near the window where smoke could escape easily. It kept the fire away from the doorway, and it used the back wall as a reflector, radiating heat into the room. The smoke blackening was evidence of a system in balance, of humans living within their means, using resources sustainably. The soot represented meals cooked but also wood not burned, forests not depleted, winters survived without exhausting fuel supplies. On the 9th day, I decided to spend 3 consecutive nights in the dwelling without any fire, recording temperature data continuously, testing whether the structure could truly maintain comfort through the coldest part of November. The weather forecast showed clear skies and dropping temperatures, with lows predicted in the low 20s, perfect conditions for a rigorous test. I moved all my camping gear into the dwelling that afternoon. I would not leave the alcove for 3 days except to measure outside temperature. I wanted to experience the dwelling the way its original inhabitants had experienced it, living within its rhythms, depending entirely on its passive systems for warmth. The first night began with typical conditions. Sunset at 5:34 p.m., inside temperature 71 degrees, outside temperature 43 degrees. I ate a cold dinner of jerky and dried fruit. As darkness came, I laid out my sleeping pad in the main room against the back wall. By 8 p.m., the inside temperature had dropped to 67 degrees. Outside it was 36 degrees. I could feel the dwelling releasing its stored heat, the back wall warm against my shoulders. I wrote in my notebook by headlamp, recording observations, trying to describe what it felt like to inhabit this space, the sense of being held by the earth, the quiet. At 10 p.m., inside 64 degrees, outside 31 degrees. I lay down to sleep, pulling one blanket over me. The stone radiated warmth through my back. My breath did not fog the air. I could hear wind outside the alcove, but inside the dwelling, the air was absolutely still. I woke at 2 a.m. and checked the thermometer. Inside 61 degrees, outside 25 degrees. A 36-degree differential. I had not needed the second blanket. My feet were warm. My hands were warm. At 5 a.m., I woke again. Inside 58 degrees, outside 22 degrees. I was starting to feel cool. I reached for the second blanket and pulled it over me. Comfortable again. At 6:30 a.m., the sun had not yet reached the alcove. Inside temperature 57 degrees, outside 23 degrees. I stood and stretched, feeling slightly stiff but not chilled. The dwelling had brought me through the coldest night, maintaining a 34-degree differential without any fire. Day 2 was cloudless. The sun hit the alcove at 9:24 a.m., and within 30 minutes the inside temperature had climbed to 62 degrees. By noon, it reached 72 degrees. By 3 p.m., it peaked at 75 degrees. The back wall was too hot to touch comfortably, radiating heat that filled the room. The second night was colder than the first. By 8 p.m., the outside temperature had dropped to 29 degrees. Inside, it was 68 degrees. I built a small cooking fire, using about 3 pounds of juniper wood, and heated a simple meal. The fire burned for 25 minutes, raising the room temperature to 72 degrees briefly, then died back to coals. By 9 p.m., the temperature was back to 68 degrees. I slept deeply that second night, waking only once at 3 a.m. to check temperature. Inside, 59 degrees, outside, 18 degrees. A 41-degree differential, the largest I had measured. Dawn on day 3 showed inside temperature at 55 degrees, outside at 19 degrees. The dwelling had lost 13 degrees overnight, while the outside temperature had dropped 35 degrees. The rate of heat loss was slowing. The dwelling was approaching its lower equilibrium point, but that equilibrium was 55 degrees, which was survivable. In the afternoon of day 3, clouds began moving in, blocking the sun. I watched the inside temperature, expecting it to drop immediately, but it didn't. The thermal mass was carrying the dwelling forward on stored heat from the morning hours. The system had inertia, preventing rapid temperature changes. By evening, the clouds were thicker. Outside temperature at sunset was 36 degrees, warmer than the previous 2 nights because of cloud cover. Inside it was 65 degrees. The third night was my warmest night, never dropping below 27 degrees outside. Inside, the temperature held at 62 degrees all night. I woke at dawn to see the alcove floor covered with a thin layer of snow, blown in by wind. Outside the alcove, the canyon was white. Inside the dwelling, it was 61 degrees, comfortable, dry, protected. I had proved what I came to prove. The dwelling worked without fire, maintained comfort through multiple cold nights, used only solar energy and the Earth's stored heat. The secret was simple: work with the sun, not against it. Use mass to store heat. Build thick, build small, build in the right place. The stone holds the sun long after it sets.